Ontology both doesn't account, like it fails on two fronts, like not to account for the relational structure of the production of subjects and the historical structure of it, and then the element of subjective freedom.
Yeah.
So it's bad.
Yeah.
So it's
no
bad.
bueno.
That's why, I mean,
no bueno.
yeah, it doesn't take much to convince me that ontology is not good, but
Hello. This is What's Left of Philosophy. I'm Will. Here with me today is Lillian.
Hi.
Gil.
Hello.
And Owen.
hey.
Today we are discussing Frantz Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, published in 1952. Born in 1925 and died in 1961, Fanon wore many hats throughout his short life. He was a philosopher, dramatist, psychiatrist, and of course, political revolutionary. And as you will see, these multiple facets of Fanon are key for understanding Black Skin, White Masks. Fanon was born on the island of Martinique while it was still under French colonial rule. I think many of our listeners probably know Fanon as the revolutionary author of The Wretched of the Earth that was published in 1961. He feverishly raced to finish it as he knew he was dying from leukemia. But Fanon did not start out as a critic of France or French colonialism. He enlisted in the Free French forces to fight in World War II because, as he will narrate elsewhere, he felt compelled to fight for the freedom of humanity. Fanon fought in the Battle of Alsace and was wounded in Colmar. After the end of the war, he received the Croix de Guerre. I bring up Fanon's World War II experience for two reasons. First, there's a tendency to read Fanon's thought as moving from the phase of striving for recognition, found in Black Skin, White Masks, to the phase of revolutionary violence when he arrives in Algeria during the revolution against France in the text The Wretched of the Earth. But Fanon was no stranger to the reality of violence even when he was young. And the violence of World War II, as Jean-Paul Sartre will comment, was formative for this generation. As early as Black Skin, you can find the thematic of violence and revolutionary struggle throughout the book. The second reason I mention his experience in World War II is because it was also formative for Fanon's consciousness of racism. There are two key moments that shaped him. First, when France fell to the Nazis in 1940, French sailors were blockaded on Martinique and overthrew the government to erect the collaborationist Vichy regime. Fanon recounts his experience as a traumatic awareness of the racism that French people harbored towards the black and brown people of the island. There are complaints of harassment and sexual misconduct from Martinican residents about the French sailors. Fanon ended up fleeing Martinique as a dissident. And then second, the end of the war confronted Fanon with the wider phenomenon of European racism when his regiment was purged of black soldiers when journalists came to take photographs. I think it is experiences like these that led Fanon to claim in one of my personal favorite essays of his, Racism and Culture, quote, "A society has race prejudice or it has not. There are no degrees of prejudice. One cannot say that a given country is racist, but that lynchings or extermination camps are not found there. The truth is that all and still other things exist on the horizon. These virtualities, these latencies circulate, carried by the life stream of psychoaffective economic relations," end quote. These two experiences, the necessity of struggle and the reality of racism, shaped what was to become Black Skin, White Masks. So what is the central argument of the text? First-time readers of Black Skin will no doubt be puzzled by the lack of traditional argumentation, and they may even expect that it is a book about how racist French people are, yes, but black people are as much the object of critique, a point I will return to shortly. There are many interpretations of what Fanon is up to and what readers find interesting. I cannot hope to cover everything that happens in the text, but what I would like to do is give both first-time readers and experts a provocative entry into the work. My interpretation is unorthodox, but, I back myself. I think I'm right. Black Skin, White Masks is fundamentally a book about the alienation of reason. Fanon from the outset claims that the economic foundations of colonial society introduces psychopathologies into all of its inhabitants. This includes the black people, or the quote-unquote racialized. Fanon approaches the social theory of French Martinican society as a psychiatrist. He was trained in this art of medicine, analyzing its pathogenetic structure. Colonial society, a society divided against itself, shapes both black and white subjects such that, quote, this is Fanon, the white man is locked in his whiteness, the black man in his blackness, end quote, and thus both are afflicted with, quote, double narcissism, end quote. The first order problem of racism is not the irrational hatred of difference or the other. It is the desiccation, the withering away of the conditions for intersubjectivity. Reason for Fanon is essentially the ability to take on and understand the reasons given by other free creatures such as myself. Throughout the book, Fanon continually pleads for understanding and communication. And this is so because Fanon thinks we can only be free insofar as we can develop and express novel reasons for our conduct. Colonial society practically inverts, and not just ideologically, our conduct such that our behavior is pre-interpreted. This is the struggle of the narrator in the famous chapter 5, The Lived Experience of the Black, where everything the narrator does to be recognized as a free being is interpreted as a feature of his blackness. We might think of this as the problem of stereotypes, where blacks are implicitly associated with criminality, sexual deviance, or cultural backwardness. The cure, and I put that in scare quotes, because Fanon is writing as a psychiatrist in some ways, would be for people to meet real blacks and see that the stereotypes are not true. This response, which focuses on ideology, is insufficient insofar as it assumes that the rationalizations of racism emerge from the pathological structures of subjectivity rather than the pathological structures of social life. And this is what I take to be Fanon's central claim about racism. It is not irrational per se, but is the endless proliferation of rationales that follow from a deeply unequal society. We often talk about racism as a failing of moral character, a type of ignorance, or an irrational mental quirk. But Fanon dramatizes that racism endlessly talks about itself, endlessly gives rationales for why society is the way it is, but that does not mean it is reasonable. Fanon describes racism as attempting to rationalize itself, and thus he implies a distinction between rationality in unequal conditions and what reason would look like under conditions of equality and social freedom. People may not believe racist ideas, but the public space of reasons is flooded with racist rationales that subjects may spontaneously reach for. The practical distortion of social life traps subjects in circles of unreasonable rationalizations. Much like Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, I argue that Fanon offers a social theory of racial fetishism. A quick example of what I mean here: when Michael Brown was murdered by that police officer, and the police officer rationalized his actions of how many times he shot him by saying his body bulked up to run through a hail of bullets, we know that human bodies do not do that, and we know that that statement is unreasonable, and yet this was the spontaneous rationale he offered for his conduct. He may not have believed it, but he understood he had to give some sort of way of rationalizing why he did what he did. And so the question would be to ask, how a society generates such rationales for that type of conduct? Fanon thinks that we are intrinsically reason-giving creatures, and that reason is integral to our freedom and humanity. We need to be able to give accounts of ourselves and what we are doing to others who receive these accounts and give us their accounts in return. I'm reminded of our episode with Martin Haglund, where he claimed that we need reason like we need food and water. Fanon clearly thinks the same. Colonial society alienates its subjects from nourishing reason and damns them to the unreasonable rationalities of racism and exploitation. The cure, again in scare quotes, that Fanon offers is the practical struggle to establish the social conditions for intersubjective reason. I want to close with my most polemical interpretation of black skin. You will note that I referred to the narrator of chapter 5. Most interpreters assume that chapter 5, because it is written in the first person, is about Fanon's experience with racism. I think Fanon is offering a literary dramatization of the unreasonable rationality of racist culture that is meant to evoke the insight of the reader who has been malformed by bourgeois society. In the introduction, Fanon describes chapter 5 as a dramatization of, quote, the black man confronted with his race, end quote. He does not say, my confrontation with my race. Indeed, throughout the chapter, the narrator describes transforming into an animal with antennae and pseudopodia, much like Kafka's narrator in The Metamorphosis, which Fanon owned in his library. Much like Kafka and Hegel, Marx, Kierkegaard, all of whom Fanon explicitly draws from, the drama is meant to open our insight into some fundamental truth of our situation. If the colonial situation is one where the capacity for intersubjective reason is so distorted, then the indirectness of aesthetic communication may be the only method available. There's much more I want to say, but I've gone on much too long, so now I'll turn it over to the rest of the crew. What did you all think of Black Skin, White Masks?
Maybe one place to start, just the title of the chapter itself, right? And the emphasis on lived experience and what lived experience means for Fanon in his analysis. Because, you know, there's a lot of people on the left where the idea of like lived experience just like gives them the ick, you know, like it's just like it's associated with a kind of navel gazing, hyper emphasis on particularity. And it's seen as like an inhibiting force, like focusing on lived experience is seen as something that inhibits solidarity. But Fanon is also, there's also like a very strong universalist message with the liberation of human beings as such. And so, yeah, I wonder if one place to start would be just to, I don't know if you had anything to say about the meaning of this, like how he's using lived experience and his analysis of lived experience.
Yeah, it's pretty clear that it's not, I think you're right that oftentimes like when people invoke lived experience, they do it in order to like try to root a claim that they want to make in either phenomenological or like personal subjective reality. And in a way, he is giving us a sort of phenomenology here, but it's also one that's impersonal in a sense, right? It's not at all about like what Frantz Fanon experienced so much as it is attempting to like articulate what the conditions for intelligibility are in a colonial situation in this divided sort of Manichaean world, right? It's not him saying like, well, I experienced this one time on a train, so therefore this is what the world sort of looks like, actually. But there is an interesting difficulty here, right? Like, how do we navigate that universal in particular? Because it is like a less charitable reading would be like, he's not doing anything more than just extrapolating from his own experience. But I don't think that's what's going on.
So the structure of this chapter is interesting. So, you know, the reason why I said I hope that this episode leads new readers and also people who've already read the text to see the text differently. There's a moment in the very first paragraph, chapter 5, where he says, these are the pieces put back together by another me.
Yeah.
And so, you know, I think some people read this as Fanon almost telling his immediate autobiography of what it is like to be black. I've already said that my claim is I don't even think Fanon means this for it to be him. I think that this is a narration, but even within the text, there is this, this retrospective putting together of what this experience means. Why is that important? It means what he's using as lived experience isn't the immediate undergoing of some event. It is actually, time has passed and reason is putting back together what this says about the social situation of France. What's very strange in the lived experience of the Black is, sure, he writes in the first person, but there are a whole bunch of other voices in there. There's, the mother with her child. There are these disembodied, what I call French liberals saying, oh, no, we don't have race prejudice here. Oh, no, I'm a great lover of the Blacks. And the reason why I described racism as a series of rationalities is the 5th chapter is filled with all the spontaneous rationalizations that people have ready to hand when anything having to deal with the inequality of French society is raised. And so I think it's actually trying to show, if one to be technical, that these are the background conditions of how people make sense to one another. And for Fanon, what you're supposed to see is there is no authentic communication happening. It's just a bunch of cliches bouncing off of one another rather than what he calls authentic communication. And so the last thing I'll say is, remember that chapter 5, it's well written. It's one everyone talks about, but sometimes it's as if it's not the middle of the book. The book doesn't end there. Chapter 5, the narrator, and I'm going to say this polemically, the narrator's a failure. the narrator fails
Yeah.
to get to freedom. And so there's also a sense in which this is a moment that we're supposed to pass through, not actually stay there and think that, this is the central argument for freedom.
So I actually really like this interpretation because I was having very similar thoughts when I was reading it. So I read this probably a few years, like it's been several years since I've had a look at this chapter. And I think that when I was taught about this or last did it in a reading group, I was like less attuned to its argumentative structure. It's like people were kind of thinking through the psychoanalytic, the phenomenological, the ontological elements of it and pulling out, just kind of trying to pull out the concepts, which I would also like us to do. But I was really struck by the narration of the text where like you think it's going to arrive in a place where like you find the authentic, almost the authentic Black reason at the end of it, and you don't. And there's something really important about going through these stages because it can't be just about, I mean, these are certainly things I'm sure that he's thought and experienced, but every stage that he walks through is recognizable. And if you've ever spent any time in talking about debates about race and identity or race and class, they're all prefaced and presaged here. And I actually think the one with the back and forth with Sartre is like the most interesting because it's the most difficult. And I think most people interpret this as a critique of Sartre, but I think it's not a critique. It's a analysis of the experience of arguing with a Hegelian or a Marxist about this and the despair you feel when you're doing it, frankly, because they might be right. Like
yes.
So like there
Sorry,
I
I'm
feel
so
like,
glad you said that. Yes.
Like I feel like I'm feeling the anxiety I have felt myself and watched people feel in dealing with those arguments about like where the social transformation that has to happen and what happens to race. Like I think about even not arguments with Marxists, but arguments with liberals, like Elizabeth Anderson's book on the imperative of integration. People really don't like that book. Why? Because she says Blacks have to change, whites have to change, we all have to change. And there's something existentially frightening about even liberal imperatives to do the same. And I think something else happens with the Marxist side of the argument as well. So I did get a sense that like it's the narration of a feeling of a series of phases of arguments, not like just about it's not just about the lived experience of race, which is also there, but the lived experience of making sense of race. If that is what you meant by series of rationalities.
That's well put.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he says as much at the end of the introduction when he's like saying, what's the structure of the book? And he says, like, in this chapter, what's going on? We are witness, he writes, to the desperate efforts of a Black man striving desperately to discover the meaning of Black identity, right? Like the attempt to make sense and finding that. Part of what I think that he's trying to show is like you said, all of the debates seem presaged here, but they were presaged for him, right? Like what he's describing is like the capture in advance of what that meaning is, of what is it to have this or that sort of experience, to try to assert yourself as a reasonable being, or okay, fine, you won't let me have that, then I'll be unreasonable. Oh, but that's captured in advance too, right? Like none of it actually works, right? It is like it is a pathway of despair, but unlike in Hegel, we don't get to absolute knowing at the end. We get to just like, well, fuck, I guess we just aren't free. None of us. Like,
and like
we get to weeping. Yeah,
this like search for recognition isn't going to get us there, or the denial of being recognized, or the desire to be recognized. You know what I mean? It seems to me like at the end of the chapter that the whole recognition model, as a model for attempting to resolve the pathologies of racialization. It's just not, it just breaks down. And then he pushes towards like, okay, we need a total material reorientation and transformation of society in order to make any of these pathologies addressable. It goes in a revolutionary direction.
Yeah, I mean, what's really fascinating about Chapter 5, and, I'm glad you all already said it because, I'm always picking at this, the narrator, when the narrator realizes, okay, so I can't just be like one of you, I'm going to plunge into the negritude of Senghor and Césaire. And that seems like a moment of freedom, like I'm going to bathe in the irrational. I'm cosmic with the harmonies and all of that. And then what happens? Another voice comes up and says, oh, yes, we too in Europe had our irrational phase. You will one day grow out of that, son. And and I think the existential feeling that's being narrated by the narrator, to use Lillian's language, is not just I need to make sense of myself, but I need to feel like my reasons are my own. And to find out that actually they're pre-captured, that they're not even my reasons, they're reasons that have already fit a pre-made constellation. Yeah, I actually found myself when I got to the Sartre part, and it's Sartre's essay Black Orpheus, where he's like, yeah, the negritude movement is obviously a minor premise in the movement of class revolution towards the abolition of race. I tend to think that what the narrator realizes is, even if Sartre is right, even if the narrator agrees, he ought not have said it. I needed to lose myself in this moment and discover this for myself as emerging from my own conduct. And I think what's happening here is to just put a pin on what Owen said, is that this does end in a moment of failure where this striving for intersubjective recognition is constantly stymied by the disordered society in which this struggle is taking place. And then the question becomes, so how do we understand the society in which this is taking place, and what can be done about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the encounter with Sartre is really difficult. It feels difficult. Like on the page, it feels like a...
That's where I think like Fanon himself is seeping into the text.
Yeah.
He was very close intellectually with Sartre.
Yeah, and he draws a lot of insight from, I think, especially anti-Semite and Jew, with differences, right? Like there's a really, I think, important insight that he's got at some point where he's discussing anti-Semite and Jew, where Sartre says something like, for the anti-Semite, the Jewish person is overdetermined by the idea of their Jewishness, right? Like what it is that the anti-Semite, or what an anti-Semitic society thinks about what it is to be a Jewish person, completely overdetermines their being. And he goes, that's close to, but not exactly what happens to the black person in a racist society, because it's not the idea, but the appearance, right? There's like a way in which the literal external outward appearance of epidermalization of this like inferiority complex means that he says essentially like a Jewish person can pass, I can't. I'm not given that opportunity. But even so, he thinks that there's a lot there like that helps clarify what's going on in the denial of the other's freedom. But then we get to Black Orpheus, and he's like, oh no, dude, like you're gonna tell me that like I'm just reduced to like, what it means to be black, or negritude is just the childhood stage. We've got like now like a weird stagist interpretation of the sort of implacable dialectical motor of history, and we're gonna like be transcended into like the real universal of the proletariat, and like I got nothing left. Like fuck. Like that is like a sad...
So y'all already figured it out? What do I have to contribute?
Right.
Oh, okay. End the book here.
Yeah. No, it feels like a moment of like betrayal. It really does to me, at least.
I also think what's interesting is I promised myself I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm not quite sure I understand the, let's say, pessimistic or ontological readings of Fanon, where throughout chapter 5, he clearly does yearn for and believe in the universal humanism. Even when he's talking about anti-Semitism, he understands it as, but anti-Semitism, it belongs to the same hatred of humanity, and thus it does involve me. Thus, I am called to be responsible for it. And so I don't think that this book makes sense without the background understanding that Fanon thinks that there's either in reality or in potentiality some reasonable form of humanity in which we all can share. And I think that that's also what provokes the despair and the failure of it, that reason is being so impaired and alienated, and yet that is what we need in order to experience freedom.
I actually would like to clarify some of the different terms, because like I said, I feel like what's really important about this book and why it is so foundational is the several different discourses in which it is taking part, which are sort of typical of the 50s. I mean, some of it it's very familiar. On the other hand, I don't always understand exactly how they're being used. So like, I'm most curious about this thing about narcissism. So in the introduction, after he says the essay will attempt to understand the black-white relationship. The white man is locked in his whiteness, the black man in his blackness. We shall endeavor to determine the tendencies of this double narcissism and the motivations behind it. And then later, how can we break the cycle? We have just used the word narcissism. We believe, in fact, that only a psychoanalytic interpretation of the black problem can reveal the affective disorders responsible for this network of complexes. So that's all to say, you can see, like, in the spiraling literature about this, there's the affect dimension, the psychoanalytic dimension. There's the existential dimension. There's just so many different routes. But I just feel like, what is narcissism doing as a diagnostic in this text? Like, it comes out again, and I think in chapter 5, but like, what kind of psychoanalytic perspective is this coming from, and then what work does it do?
Yeah, that's a really good question.
I'm just thinking about it. I mean, one of the things I think it refers to is the reflection of yourself back to yourself as substantial and whole, as if the white person or the black person, there is something substantial and whole about about being white, or about being black, or black identity or white identity. And so I think, like, that substantiality and wholeness, like, he wants to show that these things are obviously a product of history, that these identity categories are intersubjectively mediated, dependent on the way that others are reflecting me back to myself, and that we're actually fragmented and fractured, alienated, not whole at all. And the narcissism is like the cheap short circuit attempt to be made whole through, I don't know, racial mythology and shit.
Yeah, I was just going to say two quick things about it. So one, I think that there is I will say, quasi-Freudian use of narcissism here. And just, cliff notes of what Freud says about narcissism, and I'm going off of my memory, is it's a stage in childhood development where the child doesn't actually make any distinctions between itself and the world. So the world is the child is the world. So the mother is supposed to be a part of the child's needs. And one of the traumatic things of childhood is when the mother, the parent, society says, no, you don't get that. And it's reasserted that this is a socially mediated world rather than a world that simply is me speaking to myself. What he seems to be saying here is that, colonial society is a society that for both the black person and the white person, they don't understand the world as, socially mediated. They simply understand the world through their own spontaneous categories, and thus can't actually confront the reasons coming from the other person. The last thing I will say is that this is a hard thing to say, because I think you wouldn't expect Fanon to be saying this but the reason why I also don't think the narrator of chapter 5 is Fanon is because there's also a bit of a critique of the narrator in chapter 5. And the critique is the narrator is almost a paranoid subject. The narrator can't actually get into the world. And of course, there are social reasons for this. The narrator described himself as, they've amputated my enthusiasm. I can't get to the world. But in, I believe it's chapter 2, where Fanon is reading this novel by a black man. And he doesn't like the novel very much, but it's because the black person is so sensitive about their race that they can only think about it. And we can explain that. That doesn't mean that we have to say that they're a bad person, but that's narcissism, that they actually can't escape these categories. So the line right after what Lillian said, I think this is partially what he's trying to do with making psychoanalysis a part of a social theory to make the human being actional, is we are aiming for a complete lysis and analysis of this morbid universe. We believe that an individual must endeavor to assume the universalism inherent in the human condition in order to rid themselves of these defects. And so he's trying to say that these psychoanalytic sociological pathologies are due to a pathological social world that needs to be overturned. But brass tacks, I think what he's trying to say is that both black and white, they're alienated. They can't truly communicate with one another. And throughout the text, the last thing I'll say is he constantly uses this language of cycle and circle. Even chapter 5, he describes himself as being trapped in a vicious circle. That's narcissism, being trapped in the circle of yourself rather than being able to authentically engage and cooperate with what is not yourself.
Yeah, I think that's also what's going on with his account of the desire on the part of a lot of black people to look back to a golden age of, like, to all kinds of underappreciated aspects of black history, right? And even he talks about like African antiquity and the kind of pleasure and joy of like discovering, oh, there was this great like civilizational advance that nobody takes stock of, and this attempt but I think he still, it's not like it's in an uncomplicated way he thinks it's bad to something bad about that or wrong, but I do think at times it seems like he thinks it still falls into the kind of narcissism, and his message seems to be like there is no self-relation, the way we relate to ourselves as black or white or whatever, that's going to get us out of this vicious circle. That's going to get us out of these social pathologies. Like, you know what I mean? It's not a secessionist kind of politics.
Well, I mean, I think there's two. I guess the reason I asked about narcissism, not the reason has evolved after both of your responses, is that it seems to me like there's a couple different levels of narcissism you could be talking about. So in the beginning, Will was talking about, was it the reification of race? There's a narcissism in the production of bourgeois society in its own image. So like at the level of the social whole, there is a way in which, as you're saying, bourgeois society can't understand itself outside of the terms of its own categories, its own terms. So it's self-referential. And what I really loathe about most of the academy at this point is like that, to me, the problem in talking about this, like it's just Western values, is just totally obscuring the social conditions that make this possible. Like it is because a form of society has in fact universalized that it becomes self-referential in this way. And in a way, the spread of global capitalism is a form of narcissism. And like, I think, I wrote a paper once in grad school about object relations narcissism as a way of talking about fetishism. So that's like, I don't know, that's like one big idea. Apropos. But then the other idea is actually just more psychological, which is, what is narcissism actually like? There's psychiatrists describe this in different ways, but one common way is to talk about a grandiose ego that is very vulnerable because like the ego core is not very strong and self-confident. So it overcompensates by having a grandiose ego and therefore is very vulnerable to being hurt. And there are many reasons for this in early childhood development and your relationship with your parents. But like as a description of the experience of living in a racialized society, that sounds about right to me for everyone involved. Like that's, the ease with which the ego gets punctured and is insecure. And it is a very alienating way of living with other people. Horrible, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, like a couple of things here. One is like, in one of the sentences that Will just quoted, Fanon uses the word lysis. He's like, we're aiming for like a lysis. And I looked that up because I don't know what words mean, and I looked it up. So it's like a biological process of like a cell's dissolution, the dissolution of the membrane of the cell wall that holds it together. The experience that he's describing is one of, the failure of intersubjectivity even being possible, so that you're kind of locked in with yourself and there's nothing else but yourself. You're not actually encountering others at all, which is a necessary component, he thinks, of human freedom in like, encountering others. So one way to answer your question, which is really good, Lillian, is like, I think this like imposed narcissism on both sides is this inability to get outside oneself. The other thing that I wanted to draw attention to, he says in the beginning, in the introduction, he says the whole book is structured around temporality. And I didn't notice that last time I read this, and I was like, whoa, really? What does that mean? For real?
So, the whole book?
The whole book? What does that mean? And then, he's very clear that this is first a series of economic relations that is then internalized and epidermalized, right? This like inferiority thing. Yeah. But very clearly, first an economic thing. And then when we get to the conclusion, he says stuff like bourgeois society produces all these psychopathologies. And what he means by bourgeois society is something like when things are ossified, when there is this inability for like a futural orientation to be possible, where something new or open to be possible at all. And part of the narcissism here is this is what it looks like to be trapped in the past, right? To constantly be looking to the past for resources, because that's really all you think you've got. But he's saying again and time and again, he's like, the past can't help us here. It can't. Like, what we need is a future. That's what's missing. Go to and he says, there's like a sort of funny line, bleak, gallows humor, I guess, where he's like, look, I wouldn't be like mad if we discovered that there was like a black philosopher who wrote letters with Plato. It's like, I wouldn't be like,
with Plato,
like that would be cool, but I don't know how much good that would do to like child laborers in Martinique, right? And this is like the thing. It's those economic relations in the present that demand transformation in order for intersubjective relations to become possible. And that's why, like, if there's like a sort of moment of critique, or several moments, I'm sure, of things that we could say he's being critical of the narrator in chapter 5. But one of them is like, this person is just looking for the recognition to happen while leaving those economic relations intact. And he's sort of like, what did you expect?
I love that you point out the gallows humor, because if there's anything I want our listeners to know is, like, actually Fanon is quite funny throughout Blacks and White Masks. He does tell jokes. Obviously they're dark jokes and all of that, but I think that's also a part of the method, because some of it is, when you laugh, at least Fanon seems to think, it breaks you out of the mold of the sort of preconceived, predetermined relationships that you think through the world. The line about bourgeois society, I'll just read it out because it's very nice. And for me, bourgeois society is any society that becomes ossified in a predetermined mold, stifling any development, progress, or discovery. For me, bourgeois society is a closed society where it's not good to be alive, where the air is rotten and ideas and people are putrefying. And I believe that a man who takes a stand against this death is, in a way, a revolutionary. And another quick thing I'd like to say, so Blacks and White Masks, that wasn't actually Fanon's original title. I think it was Francis Janson who gave it that title. Originally, the book was supposed to be called The Disalienation of the Black Man. And so another thing that I think we could talk about is that, this notion of disalienation is really key for Fanon.
I was hoping we could.
And so it's not just disalienation from people's racist ideas. In the conclusion, again, he's saying these things that you wouldn't expect Fanon to say, where he's saying, I am not the slave of, the history of slavery. I have not the right to demand reparations. You might think, wait a second, whoa. I thought we're a fan of reparations here in the year 2023. But the point is, because the theme of this work is time, Fanon actually really is saying we need to be able to let go of history so that we can make the leap into something new. And he's taking leap from people like Kierkegaard and Sartre and all of that. And so it's really fascinating that a lot of what Fanon is saying is, even for the Black person, you need to be able to let go of what has happened so that you can participate creatively in what could be. And that's why the beginning epigraph of the conclusion is Marx's 18th Brumaire of drawing the poetry from the future.
And let the dead bury the dead.
Let the dead bury the dead. And I think for Fanon, he thinks you can't take responsibility for the world and give reason for the world so long as you are constantly facing backwards at what has been done. I just want to be clear, that is a controversial claim. And other, Africana thinkers certainly saw that that's what he was saying. People like Glissant and Césaire had questions about it, but I wanted to say that because that is Fanon's argument. So he is making an argument, and you can contest it and disagree with it, but that seems to be what he thinks.
And just to add to that, like right below that part, he says, I, a man of color, want but one thing. And it's a universal thing. He says, may man never be instrumentalized, right? Like the kingdom of ends. May the subjugation of man by man, that is to say, of me by another, cease.
I love a good Kantian ending. It just, we can't get away from it. It's about the kingdom of ends.
He even mentions, the starry sky above.
I have this line.
Okay,
this is good.
Got it.
He says, it is not the black world that governs my behavior. My black skin is not a repository for specific values. The starry sky that left Kant in awe has long revealed its secrets to us, and the moral law has doubts about itself.
Wow.
Again, that's just very funny.
There's something I'm interested in about this idea of how to think about history in order to have a non-alienated future. I think this is what he thinks, and I have always thought this in a way. But I want to kind of flag it because I think it's worth tending to how counterintuitive it is to contemporary sensibilities. Like what people mostly think of is restitution, redress, and so on. And then we have this sort of moral spiral where immediately people say, well, some things can never be forgiven. And my question is the point of justice or freedom forgiveness? Maybe. But I think that, like, he's saying no in a way. And that's worth contending with, because I hardly ever talk about my students, and I know some of them listen, so I'm sorry. But we had a whole week on historical injustice this week, and I noticed that the interlocutor for the text we were reading is somebody saying that what matters are contemporary injustices and solving them and redressing them and moving forward into the future. This is like a view people have. And the author we were reading was like, no, no, no. History matters because of the politics of memory, basically. And it's not just an economic problem, which is true. But I noticed that none of my students actually picked up on or responded to the argument that the text was actually about, which is that some people are saying that what matters is injustice in the present and finding a way to move forward. That was not intuitive to anybody. Nobody defended it. Nobody picked up on it, because that's not the paradigm right now. Whenever the text I'm referring to was written in like 2005 or 7 or something. And I think that because we can't see the future anymore, that is like a totally inaccessible set of claims, whether from a liberal or a left wing or what, like from any ideological direction. It's just not accessible to us. So the only thing we have is redress and restitution, usually on moral grounds and symbolic grounds. And then, interestingly enough, we affirm immediately that such gestures are not enough. So like the Dutch government just apologized for slavery, and everybody like, this is fake bullshit, it's not enough, blah, blah, blah. And that's obviously a fact, but that's what you get if you can't see the future, in a way. There is no redress without the so-called economic insufficiency of it all. But like, there's a lack of common sense going on with Fanon, and I do think it's counterintuitive to then double down on the more pessimistic reading of him as if that's what he was saying all along. I think that's a symptom of what can appear or not appear to us today.
Yeah, as though like the point of all these arguments is like, so stick with the past that you can't do anything about. Like, that doesn't seem to be his tenor or his aim at all, right? As far as I could tell.
So this is another sort of bugaboo of mine. Lillian's been putting this in a tract of like, clearing up phrases. One that has bedeviled scholarship for decades. What the fuck does he mean by zone of non-being?
Oh God, yeah, thank you.
Delicious phrase, when he's just like, the black cannot enter what he calls that veritable hell, that zone of non-being. Well, here's my reading of what's going on there. The zone of non-being, I'm being really reductive here, but I just want to be polemical, is actually good. The zone of non-being is the place of freedom for him.
He says that.
Where you...
He says that.
I know he does. I know.
I know. It's funny that just like saying like a thing, like he said a phrase would be polemical, but you're not wrong.
Yeah, but I back myself, and the text is there because for him the zone of non-being is where you generate space from all the contingent determinations of being and allow yourself to, he calls it, this sort of upsurge of freedom, to recreate yourself, what he calls freedom. And this links up with chapter 4, which I didn't have you all read, where he's saying the point of this psychological, psychiatric work is not so that the subject turns inward again, but that they realize that no, what's necessary for their freedom is a transformation of the world as such. And so, I think some people read the zone of non-being as, that's where black people are because they are not being. But then why is he saying near the end, the black man is not no more than the white man? He thinks that we are not, and this is, look, it's existentialism 101, it's Sartre, it's Beauvoir, that we are not essentially anything. What we are this, the openness of engagement and creativity of what we can do together towards the future. And so I actually think it's really interesting that how Fanon is read also changes given the sort of social ideological conditions in which the text is approached. And so we live in conditions where it seems as if actually bourgeois society more than ever has won, and we are, plunged into this narcissism where, we cannot see a way forward, and all we can do is be stuck in the past. And perhaps, again, that is the way, and Fanon is wrong, but that's not what he thinks. He thinks, our freedom comes from, he uses the French, it's not translated well here, of dépouillement, which is, literally stripping
away,
the skin away, so that, we can, touch the world again with reason, rather than with the historical rationalities we've inherited.
Yeah, it's very strange to read the zone of non-being line in like a purely pessimistic mode, because in order to do that, you have to completely ignore the existentialist context of like, all the work that was being done by people like Sartre and Beauvoir, with whom he's like directly engaging, for whom like negation is like a movement of freedom, right? Like the essential non-being of human being is like its ability to transcend its given condition or situation.
Their lack of essence.
Yeah.
And the problem of racism, but I think he thinks of broader bourgeois capitalist colonial society, is it only talks about essences. It essentializes everything. And it tries to essentialize race, essentialize hierarchies, essentialize what freedom is. And when you start thinking of it that way, it just all feels very claustrophobic. And that is why, almost rightfully so, the narrative chapter 5 is so paranoid. There's like nowhere to move. There's no place to go. Everything is already explained, already in place, nothing to do but just go along with the ride.
One of the little funnies that really like got me giggling just now, but also when I was reading, is when he says, "And there's no point sidling up crabwise with a mea culpa look, instead insisting it's a matter of salvation of the soul." Just like I had this idea of like, the little crab.
Yeah, it's just like
okay.
Apparently in the French, that's actually in the French, it's like a Creole bit of jargon he's using there. And so it is like, it's meant to, I think people Martinique would have found it funny when reading it in French, but I think it's also funny in English. It's a very
or just
strange
somebody
image,
who watches like crab reels on Instagram would really enjoy
that too. Okay.
Okay, so I actually wanted to because I'm in the interest of, and you guys can tell me if you want to move on to something else, but I asked about narcissism in psychology. I'm like curious about how he introduces ontology, because we were talking about the existentialist way of thinking about this. And there's a point where he says this is not possible to resolve by ontological means. And I'm trying to find the passage. I think it might be the beginning of chapter 5.
But any ontology is made impossible in a colonized and acculturated society.
Yeah, so I can see where this other reading comes from, because it says it's not possible to resolve it by means of ontology. And then, I, the materialist, think, here, Fanon, I agree. But then it says ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the Black man, and it ignores the lived experience. And then some people will argue that the situation has a double meaning. Not at all. The Black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. So that's when I can see that he means ontology not in the usual sense, but then he also says it prohibits any ontological explanation. And I can imagine reading that saying, no, that's because the ontological problem goes even deeper than you realize or something. So I'm wondering like what work does ontology do in this chapter?
I'll just point out that, like, also at the beginning of chapter 5, he has one of those lines that I love because it's an identification. He says something like, the people who I'm talking about right now, and I forget who it is exactly that he's describing, he says, their metaphysics, or, less pretentiously, their customs. And it's like,
it's like, thank you for explaining that, because I would have thought something completely different.
Yeah. No, but I think that's actually a really important moment, right? Like the stuff that we're talking about as metaphysics or as ontological, like for him is like, no, this is just a matter of like how we've structured our lives and like what it is that our forms of intelligibility are that we've inherited and how we like relate to one another or not. Like that's what we mean. I don't see any reason to think with him that would be unchangeable. You know what I mean?
I think he says at the beginning, like in the introduction, that he makes a methodological claim that he's going to do this thing called sociogeny. And he says, I'm not going to do ontogeny. I'm not going to do phylogeny. I don't know what phylogeny is.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could clarify some of this, because this is coming out of engagement with Freud, I think.
Yes, so he's getting that not just from Freud, but he's cribbing from some biological literature. So ontogeny is dealing with the etiology or the development of the individual. Phylogeny is the development of the species. But when he says sociogeny, and it's unclear, it seems like actually Fanon kind of just invented this word. You can't really find it anywhere else. So he's just like, yeah, I'm doing sociogeny.
Nice.
Understand that as he's trying to understand, look, the best way I understand it is, Marx, the historical mediation and development of the human creature in its engagement with nature and how nature impacts the creature. So he's not interested in the individual. He's not interested in, the sort of Darwinian evolution of the species. He thinks what makes the human being distinct is that they produce society and society shapes and forms them. And so he's trying to, understand that relationship. And just really quickly, I actually like that William pointed out that line about ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the black man. The translator has that since it ignores the lived experience. He actually doesn't say lived experience there. He says existence. And so since it ignores existence, and why that's important is, I think for Fanon, ontology is, it's too abstract. It engages with what the world is, absent these historical relations that make up the world. Now, I get it. Here in 2023, we mean something maybe different by ontology, but that's what he's getting at, that there isn't a distinct black world and white world. It is, a world of relationships.
Yeah.
And ontology can't tell you about that.
Like, isn't he also saying that ontology is too deterministic then, if he's opposing it to existence? Like it doesn't account for the surging of freedom.
I think that that's what he means. I think, ontology is another way of trying to erect a static image of humanity and human life, such that you start to get black ontologies and white ontologies.
Where the pessimism, that's where the pessimism comes in, is doing racial ontology.
You said it, not me. But I don't hear anything to agree with there. But yes, so he wants to talk about existence, and I hate to do that annoying thing where you talk about it's the Heideggerian thing of talking about existence etymologically. But here it makes sense. Existence, existare, literally standing out, standing into the world. So it's about not being locked in with oneself, but being out there in the world with others.
Yes, that's interesting. Ontology both doesn't account, like it fails on two fronts, like not to account for the relational structure of the production of subjects and the historical structure of it, and then the element of subjective freedom.
Yeah.
So it's bad.
Yeah.
So it's
no
bad.
bueno.
That's why
no bueno.
Yeah, it doesn't take much to convince me that ontology is not good. But
but something is, maybe there's something silly of me to say, but I feel like when people start using that word, obviously there are just lots of different ontologies. Like I think, okay, you're talking about the kind of things that exist, okay? And like I can see the reasoning behind saying like, okay, these socially constructed things called races exist, so in an ontological sense, that just would be a truism. If they exist, then they exist, and they're a social kind or whatever. But then it's like, surely you can't just like decide that by fiat, that's like the basic unit of analysis. Like, why not processes? Why not relationships? Like we have all different kinds of ontologies. And like, that's why it feels too abstract to me. Like if I say the world is made up of different kinds of things than you think, and mine's more fundamental than you, then like we have an argument already. And it just strikes me that argument has to take place at a much higher level of abstraction in order to decide whether or not that's a helpful way of talking about race. Yeah. So that's what like leaves me confused about much of this, is like, surely if we sit down and think about it, you could think about it that way, but then also you have to be responsive to why shouldn't I think about ontology in a different way? Like why can't I say that the nature of thing is something else, or the objects of analysis are different kinds of things than that? So I think that's what I got out of it. Like it's just too like, and then you end up debating about that, and then you're not talking about racism anymore.
Now we're doing meta-ontology.
Then you're doing meta-ontology. And I don't know, like I said before, I'm just like into the ontic. I'm like staying there most of my time.
yeah, I think Fanon is too.
I was about to say, I think he's quite all right there, and he thinks there's plenty of complexity and distinctions to make in that realm. And I'll just say it again, I think it's really fascinating in chapter 5 that so much of it is about the available reasons we have ready to hand for making sense of social life. And you need to be able to get some sort of view to see that those reasons aren't self-evident, that this is, evidence of actually an incredibly pathological society that actually cannot come to terms with itself and cannot take responsibility for itself. I mean, so much of chapter 5 is almost this argument of the systemic bad faith that subjects are committed to, and it isn't because of a lack of moral responsibility or character. He describes in the introduction as it's an existential deviation imposed on us. And I think that there's a lot there to think about, and to think about how we come to reason and what our rationales are. And I think he's using reason as a position of normative critique. That it is a vision of a type of society that is not only equal materially, but is equal in what makes us free creatures, which is giving reasons and taking reasons on. That and that's what allows us to cooperate and be creative and invent.
This is great. So I was hoping we could maybe as we get close to the end here, that helps link up a couple of things for me. Because I was hoping we could talk a little bit about his stated desire for a new humanism and the relationship between that and this project of disalienation. I like the way that you've been putting this, Will, and maybe I could ask you to elaborate a little bit more on it, because I hadn't, whenever people talk about alienation, and this is always the critique you get, especially coming out of the French milieus in the 60s onwards, if there's a problem of alienation, it's a question about alienation from what, and can you do that without positing an essence, and then are we, young Marx is, talking about 𝙢𝙤𝙧𝙚𝙨, and oh no, we're alienated from our species being.
We're back in romanticism.
Yeah, that's always the worry, right? So the question is, what is it that we're alienated from, such that disalienation is a project that is something that we should find desirable, and without falling back into these sort of essentializing traps. And your pitch, as far as I'm understanding, is it's alienation from or of reason, actually, as a constituent feature of what it is to be human. Sorry, we're doing a little bit of essentializing. Human beings are essentially reasonable, or ought to be.
Yikes.
Or maybe ought to be. I'm not sure.
Or need to be.
Reasons? I think need to be.
Yeah, so I don't know. There's a lot there. I'm really curious about what you all think about, how to make sense of disalienation and this problematic of alienation from what.
I will just say, in order to kind of head off at the pass, look, I've read all the things, and sorry, Gil. I've read the Althusser, the critique of humanism. I know that it's all this, isn't it so naive to think that there's some human nature, when actually the human is constitutively incomplete and mediated. And I think Fanon's yes, we are constitutively incomplete and mediated. That's why we need reason.
Oh, nice.
Because we cannot actually stand on our own. There is no actual essence in the sort of ontological, ahistorical sense awaiting us. And so the only thing I'll be able to say, because again, so much is about the future, the new humanism isn't a return to our human essence. It is actually the creation of a novel form of life of intersubjective reason. And so it would look like something that we have not yet seen. And so the alienation, strikingly, the alienation is a form of radical completeness. You are stuck in your narcissism. Nice. You're stuck in being. You're stuck in fullness. Rather than, he ends with one of these puzzling questions that, and when I first read this in my more quote unquote radical phase, dude, what the fuck are you talking about? With this question of, wasn't my freedom given to me to create the world of you? Nah, man. Your freedom's for yourself. You're a radical. But no, I think he's saying, I need others. I need others in the world. The world can't just be for me, because that's actually what we have in putrefying bourgeois society. So I think the new humanism is, something that has not yet emerged. It's a task rather than an excavation of what's been buried by bourgeois society.
So I think that's right, but there are moments where I'm a little confused, because it does seem like there's a stronger, I don't think he's doing this return to our human essence thing, but it does seem like there's a stronger normative standard in the background. I gave you the one example of the the non-instrumentalization thing, like the kind of kingdom of ends, the call for a kingdom of ends at the end. My language, not his. But he also at one point says, and this is what he says. He says, genuine disalienation will have been achieved only when things, in the most materialist sense, right, have resumed their rightful place. Right. So this emphasis on there's something that needs to be resumed. We have totally distorted, I'm open to the idea that it is, and I like this argument that it is reason. That reason is totally distorted and mutilated under existing material conditions, and that things need to be put back in place. I don't know. I honestly don't know what to make of those moments where it does seem like there is a pretty robust notion of like things are wrong and they need to be set right. And like, I'll actually be kind of straight up about what it looks like to set them right.
What if, and if Liam is listening to this, you should read his white psychodrama piece. It's actually really good. But he has this really nice line. What makes our society distinctive in the psychopathologies is the dominant ideology is something like equality, and yet the social conditions do not adhere to that ideology. And you know what? The more things change, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, Fanon at France at this time is not avowedly racist. It is the place of liberté, égalité, fraternité. UNESCO in the 50s has released this whole idea that race doesn't exist, that, it's all about universalism. And yet the material facts are not synchronized to this idea. And so I think the normative claim of reason is that, there is something severely on its own terms contradictory in bourgeois society. And it affects the fact that we give rationales for our conduct that doesn't actually link up with what our putative commitments are.
Yeah, and he says things too at the same time. Like the analysis remains materialist, or the argument, the thrust remains materialist, because he says things like, and when people go out there and struggle against this ossified bourgeois world, it's not because they thought about it for a while and they're like, oh, abstract right turns out to require that things look differently. It's because there's hunger and exploitation. Right? It's because there's this
because they cannot breathe.
Because they cannot breathe.
He says.
Yeah.
In multiple senses, yeah.
I mean, I really fuck with the critique and rescue of reason. I'm very bored with critiquing and not rescuing reason. And I think that I mean,
reason's cool.
I'm a fan of reason.
Reason's dope.
I just don't really see what we're all discussing there's something profoundly nihilistic about it. And everyone always wants to defend their favorite critiques of reason. Like they're not really that. Maybe they're not. I don't know. What do I know? I have my own area of specialization and the deep reads into some people that critique reason. Who the fuck knows? But in any case, I just feel like striving for a society in which reasons become intelligible and a form of striving based on reasons becomes intelligible seems pretty good to me. I feel I feel the way about it that Charles Mills once did about liberalism and equality and stuff. He's equality of opportunity, free civil liberties sounds good to me, man. Let's proceed.
Why not?
Let's get some reason going. Let's try reason.
I feel the same way about reason. It's I get it. Reason is hypocritical, partial, cynical. There's lots of pathologies, but also ideally, I think there's some good. We could be offering good and better reasons to do good and better things, and I guess that lane of critique just sort of ran into a cul-de-sac for me. And I read Fanon, and it actually feels extremely refreshing in 2023 to think about that stuff without being too jaded.
Yeah, I like that distinction that you drew, Will, in this regard, right? Between what does it look like to give reasons in a reasonable as opposed to an unreasonable world. And it just, the claim, I think one of the ways to understand the claim that Fanon is making is we live in an unreasonable world. It's, reasons and rationales are circulating all the time. That don't make this reasonable. We should be living in a reasonable world. That would be better.
Yeah. And I think the last thing I'll say in closing, Joe, Owen, you pointed back a couple times to Fanon talking about the non-instrumentalization of man. Fanon thinks about this notion of human beings being reduced to mechanisms a lot. And I'm not doing this thing where if Fanon talks about Marx, that means he's cool, but he is thinking about Marx. He's thinking about living within an alien force that only sees you as an instrument for its circulation of value rather than the value of freedom. And it seems to me that that's at least one thing he's picking up from Marx, which is, the actual self-activity of people rather than people being the activity of distorted form of life that is of them, but not for them.
Dig it.
All right, that does it for us today. New episodes of What's Left of Philosophy come out every 2 weeks wherever you get your podcasts. Also, check us out on YouTube for videos and live streams. Before closing out today, we'd like to take a minute to thank some of the people who are supporting the show on Patreon. We couldn't do this without you, and we're really grateful. Today's new patrons are Matt Fluck, Joel Miller, Alex McKeever, Taylor Rogers, Elliot S., KG, Eric Anderson, Edward Ponte, Lee Nelson, HW, G, Navin, D, Jack Aarons, Kali Jarvanen, Jesse Berlin, John Champagne, LS, Joe Drexel Dreiss, Gabrielle Galini. Thank you all very much. If you too like what we're doing and want to support the show, please go to our website, leftofphilosophy.com, and click the support button. Patrons get access to exclusive content like locked episodes, bonus videos, and access to our Discord server. You can also buy some What's Left of Philosophy merch from the store linked on our website. Follow us on Twitter at @LeftOfPhil, and don't forget to leave us good reviews and comments on your podcast app. With that, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.
Peace. Bye-bye.
Bye.